The winter Clara Holt lost her husband was the kind that carved grief into the land itself. Snow had settled deep across the plains, pressing against the walls of their homestead like a silent, waiting beast. The cabins of other settlers stood miles apart, each a lonely island in an unforgiving wilderness, and Clara's home felt lonelier than most. Her husband, Eli, had been the kind of man who filled silence with laughter and warmth. When fever struck him down in the dim glow of a single oil lamp, Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She buried him with her own hands on a ridge overlooking their grazing land, frost turning her tears to ice before they hit the soil. Most widows went home to family after such a loss. Most sold their land or remarried or gave up. But Clara stayed. Something fierce and unyielding had risen inside her the morning after Eli's burial. She wasn't just holding on to land, she was holding on to the last piece of him. Every fence post he hammered, every trail he cut, every dream he whispered into her hair at night, it all lived here. Leaving felt like losing him a second time, but grief didn't stop the dangers of the prairie. It only made them sharper. The cattle thieves came first. They moved like shadows in the dusk, taking a calf here, a steer there. Clara learned to sleep lightly, her shotgun across her lap, the only warmth a small fire she kept smoldering in the corner. Then came the circling rancher's men with sly voices and sharp smiles who acted as if a young widow's land were already theirs. They stopped by under the guise of checking on her, their horses pawing the dirt while they said things like, "No shame in giving up. Mrs. Holt, hard country out here for a woman alone." Clara returned every forced smile with a firm shake of her head. Alone or not, she would endure, but endurance had a cost. She felt the weight of it each morning when she carried buckets from the well, each afternoon as she checked the distant tree line for movement, each night when the wind scraped against her windows like skeletal fingers. Sometimes she wondered if the plains were testing her or if they simply wanted to swallow her whole. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, turning the sky the color of dying embers, Clara paused in her chores. A strange tension hung in the air. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She scanned the land around her, the rolling fields, the silent barn, the shadows growing long, and for the first time felt something more than fear. She felt watched. The following nights only deepened that feeling. She found tracks near the far fence line, tracks too soft for a ranch horse, too deliberate for a wandering rider. Her heart raced as she knelt to inspect them. She didn't know what she expected to find, but something told her this visitor wasn't an ordinary drifter. News traveled slowly through the prairie, but stories of Apache warriors traveling alone, wounded, separated from their people, surviving by stealth, had reached her through whispers at the trading post. Some settlers feared them with wild, trembling superstition. Others respected them. Clara, raised on both caution and compassion, didn't know what to feel. Still, every instinct cried that someone had been near her homestead, someone who observed rather than attacked. Someone who moved with intention. She began locking her doors earlier. She kept the shotgun loaded. But beneath her caution flickered a strange curiosity, an awareness she couldn't explain. Whoever walked near her land hadn't harmed her. They hadn't taken her cattle. They hadn't even approached her home. It was as if they were waiting. Clara Holt didn't yet know that the visitor watching from the shadows was not a threat, but a wounded Apache warrior whose fate was about to crash into hers with the force of a storm. She had no way of knowing that one night, one impossible encounter, would change the course of her life forever. But the prairie knew. The wind knew. And soon she would know too. Kalen moved through the prairie with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned the land could be both ally and enemy. His body ached from wounds sustained weeks earlier in a skirmish with cavalry scouts, and each step reminded him of the men he had lost. The sounds of their screams and the echo of rifles in the canyon still ringing in his mind. His tribe was gone from this stretch of land, at least, for now scattered in hiding or taken prisoner, and he was alone, a shadow drifting through the plains searching for safety. The wind carried scents that told him more than words could. The faint tang of smoke from a distant cabin, the earthy smell of wet soil after snow had melted patches of it, and the subtle scent of horses moving across grasslands. He had learned to read every hint and whisper the land offered, the way elders had taught him, but now the lessons felt heavier than usual. Each sound and smell a reminder that survival required vigilance and speed and sometimes sacrifice. Nightfall was both enemy and friend. It allowed him to move unseen, but it also brought the cold and the fear that something unseen might move toward him. He pressed himself against the cover of sagebrush and rocks, the bruises on his shoulders aching with every breath, his heart beating fast enough to echo in his skull. Hunger gnawed at him, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythm of the earth under his feet, the way the stars aligned to guide him, the small noises that could warn of predators or pursuers. Each night was a test of patience, endurance, and cunning. When he finally stumbled upon the outline of a cabin nestled in the open prairie, he paused instinctively. Smoke rose from the chimney, but it was faint, a signal of warmth, life, safety, yet also a potential trap. Kalen crouched low, studying the structure, the faint movement of curtains in the window, the sound of a dog barking in the distance. Everything about it was careful, controlled, deliberate. He had learned long ago that desperation could be deadly. A single misstep and his exile would end not with a return to his people, but in silence and dirt. Inside the cabin, a light glimmered from a lamp, casting a golden pool onto wooden floors. Kalen noted the signs of human presence. Without moving closer, the smell of cooking food faintly drifting out, the rhythm of movement inside. He watched the land around it, feeling an unfamiliar pull, a mixture of hunger for rest and the instinctive caution that had kept him alive this long. For hours he lingered on the edges of safety, a ghost in the shadows, a man caught between hope and fear. His thoughts drifted to the men he had lost, the brotherhood of warriors who had trained beside him, the bonds that could never be replaced. Grief was a constant companion, now a silent shadow at his shoulder, whispering reminders of what had been taken and what might never return. And yet the need to survive pushed him forward, urging him to make choices that were hard, cold, precise. He had to find shelter to mend his wounds and regain his strength, and perhaps find a reason to continue walking this vast, unyielding prairie. The cabin below the ridge seemed to offer a fragile promise. Kalen weighed every factor, his instinct, caution, necessity. The snow had begun to fall again, drifting down silently to blanket the land in white, a cloak hiding footsteps and danger alike. Moving now could either grant him safety or seal his fate. He took a deep, steadying breath, the cold biting into his lungs, and made a decision. He would approach, but with care, with patience, with the wariness that had kept him alive. Every movement was calculated, every sound measured, every instinct sharpened to a razor's edge. As he neared the cabin, Kalen could see faint signs of life, a woman moving in the warm lamplight, her silhouette cautious but strong. There was a dignity to her presence that struck him, a recognition of resilience in another human being, perhaps alone as he was, perhaps bearing her own burdens. The wind carried her scent, faintly guiding him closer, and the night held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when these two exiles of the prairie met. He did not yet know her name, nor she his, but destiny was already stirring in the quiet between them, preparing to shape a story that would stretch across worlds and hearts alike. Clara had always been cautious, her life sharpened by loss and the cold harshness of the prairie. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow stretching across the cabin walls, set her nerves on edge. She kept a lamp burning low, its warm glow cutting back the dark, though not enough to keep the weight of solitude from pressing against her. After years of fending for herself, she had grown skilled in reading signs, predicting movement, noticing what others might miss. The tracks near the fence had unsettled her, and tonight the unease had returned, crawling along her spine with quiet persistence. Kalen crouched beyond the barn, hidden by shadows and sagebrush. His breath came in measured puffs, forming faint clouds in the icy night. He watched the woman move with precise rhythm, seeing her strength in each motion, the careful way she lifted a bucket or stacked wood. Her focus, even in this simple domestic routine, spoke of someone used to survival, someone who could endure the lonely weight of hardship. He remained still, knowing the smallest sound could betray him, knowing that a single wrong move could end everything. Yet he could not look away. There was something in her presence, a life force bright and unyielding, that drew him forward despite reason and caution. A sudden gust of wind rattled the barn door. Clara froze, ears straining. Her hand went to the rifle resting against the wall. Fear knotted in her chest, a familiar companion, and she called out softly, though her voice carried enough to cut through the chill. "Who's there?" Her tone was steady, but her pulse raced. Whoever it was, she knew they could be friend or threat. The prairie taught lessons in trust and mistrust alike, and she had learned to honor both. Kalen made a careful step, the snow beneath his boot soft but audible in the quiet. He raised his hands, palms visible, a universal sign of peace, though he doubted she would understand at first glance. "Do not be afraid," he whispered, his voice low and measured, careful not to startle. He did not yet know the language fully in the way of strangers, but he had learned enough to convey intent. Clara's eyes narrowed, scanning, calculating, and then she saw the faint outline of his face, the sharp angles, the depth in his dark eyes. They were not cruel eyes, not filled with hunger or malice, but tired and cautious, carrying the weight of survival. Clara's hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the impossibility of the moment. This was a stranger, a man of a people spoken about in hushed tones, feared and misunderstood by her world, yet here he was, alive and vulnerable in her presence. Her instincts screamed to run, to call for help, to retreat behind locked doors, but another part of her, quieter and yet insistent, urged patience, urged curiosity. There was something different in him, something that made her hesitate before condemning him as threat or danger. Kalen, sensing her hesitation, held his position. He was no threat unless provoked, yet the very act of being here, of seeking refuge, broke rules both he and she had lived by for years. He could see the lines of tension in her posture, the brief flickers of hesitation, the guarded yet probing gaze that measured him as carefully as he measured her. It was a delicate balance, a dance neither fully understood but both compelled to perform. One wrong movement, one misstep in trust, could shatter the fragile truce forming between them. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice firmer now, less fear and more command. "Come inside." The words surprised her, though she did not retract them. There was risk, yes, but also necessity. Sometimes survival demanded courage beyond reason. Kalen's eyes softened at the invitation, and he moved slowly toward the cabin, each step deliberate, reverent almost. The wind continued to whisper outside, and the snow fell lightly, coating the prairie in white, as if shielding them from the world beyond. Inside, the lamplight pooled around them, warm and soft. Clara motioned toward a chair, while Kalen remained standing, uncertain but grateful. The distance between them seemed charged, filled with unspoken questions, fragile trust, and an undeniable tension neither could name. That night, in the quiet shadow of the prairie, two strangers from different worlds touched the edges of fate, unknowingly setting the first spark that would change everything between them forever. The night had brought them together, fragile, tentative, and yet undeniable, and neither could ignore it. The cabin smelled of firewood and simmering stew, a comforting scent Clara had almost forgotten in the cold silence of her lonely homestead. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the walls, flickering gently and painting the room in soft amber. Kalen stood near the doorway, cautious, the tension in his posture betraying both wariness and exhaustion. Clara's pulse thrummed in her ears as she studied him, noticing the faint tremor in his hands, the shallow rhythm of his breathing, the way his dark eyes shifted constantly, taking in every corner of the room. He was careful, measured, every movement a product of survival and instinct. Clara's instincts screamed that this was dangerous. A stranger, a warrior from a people her neighbors feared. Yet she could not turn him away. Something in her chest, an empathy born of loss and solitude, pushed her forward. "You need rest," she said softly, her voice carrying more warmth than she expected. "You can sit here. I'll get you something to eat." Kalen's gaze flicked to her, assessing, questioning, but he nodded, a faint sign of trust, and lowered himself into the chair she indicated as she moved around the small kitchen. Gathering bread and broth, Clara felt an unfamiliar nervousness twist in her stomach. She was alone with a man she barely knew, yet there was an unspoken intensity in the air, a magnetic tension that made her heartbeat stutter. The prairie had taught her caution, but it had also taught her resilience. She set the food before him, watching his hands as he reached out, deliberately careful not to spill or touch unnecessarily. "You are hurt," she said, unable to mask the concern in her tone. "Let me see." Kalen hesitated, the warrior pride warring with the reality of pain. Finally, he extended his arm, revealing a long, jagged gash across his forearm, the edges still raw and tender. Clara's hands moved instinctively, steady and skilled, cleaning the wound and dressing it with cloth she had prepared. The air between them thickened, charged by proximity and unspoken emotion. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and she felt the warmth of his body beneath her touch. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the lamplight casting a soft halo around them. Kalen inhaled sharply, but did not pull away, and Clara realized that she, too, had stopped. The world outside, the wind, the snow, the cold darkness fell away, leaving only this fragile, suspended moment. She studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw, the faint scar along his temple, and something in her heart stirred, a feeling she could not name. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly, almost afraid to hear the answer. Kalen's gaze held hers, intense and unwavering, and for a moment he seemed to weigh every word, every possible misstep. "I had nowhere else," he admitted softly, his voice rough from disuse and pain. "I needed shelter." Clara nodded, understanding more than she should have, feeling the truth of his words resonate with her own isolation. As the night deepened, they moved closer to the fire, sharing warmth in the silence. Words were few, but each carried weight, each glance and gesture heavy with meaning. Clara felt the pull of something unfamiliar, something forbidden yet impossible to ignore. Kalen, too, felt it, the subtle recognition that their meeting was not merely chance. That fate had carved this night from the endless prairie for reasons neither fully understood. Outside, the wind whispered across the snow, as if the land itself were watching, waiting, holding its breath. Inside, the distance between Clara and Kalen shrank, not through words but through quiet understanding, through shared vulnerability and the raw, unspoken connection of two people from worlds apart. Every moment drew them closer, hearts beating in tandem with the flickering fire. And Clara realized that this night impossible, dangerous, unforgettable had already changed something fundamental within her. By the time she rose to fetch more blankets, Kalen's gaze followed her, dark eyes reflecting lamplight and the promise of uncharted emotions. There was no certainty, no plan, no way to know what would come next. But Clara knew one truth she could not deny. One night, one shared night of trust, care, and silent connection, had shifted the axis of her world forever. The prairie had brought them together, and nothing would ever make them forget it. The dawn came pale and gray, drifting across the prairie like a ghost, and Clara felt the weight of the night's events pressing on her. Kalen slept in the corner, a blanket drawn around his shoulders, and for a moment she allowed herself to watch him, noting the tension slowly easing from his body, the lines of pain softened by rest. But peace was fleeting on the prairie. Every shadow, every sound beyond the cabin walls reminded her that danger could arrive at any moment. The knocking came first, subtle but deliberate, a slow rhythm that made her blood run cold. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the small window, she glimpsed the shapes of men on horseback, their hats low and guns glinting in the weak morning light. Ranchers, no doubt, the same men who had circled her land for weeks, sensing weakness, smelling vulnerability. Their eyes were sharp, predatory, fixed on the homestead as if they had a right to take what belonged to her. Clara's first instinct was to hide, to retreat into the safety of the back room and call for help, but there was no one to call. Only her and Kalen, two outsiders in a hostile land. Her mind raced, calculating, planning. The door could be barred, the windows covered, but they could break through if they were determined. Yet she could not leave Kalen exposed, and she could not expose herself to the wrath of men who had no respect for fear or hesitation. Kalen stirred, his eyes opening to the tension in the room. He rose silently, reading the scene with the precision of a seasoned warrior. "They are here for you," he murmured, voice low, calm, yet carrying the unmistakable edge of readiness. Clara nodded, knowing he was right. Their presence was no accident. He moved to the doorway, studying the men outside, each movement deliberate, controlled, prepared to strike if needed. The ranchers called out, their voices loud and mocking, demanding she open the door. Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of her shotgun. Every muscle in her body screamed to defend, to fight, to survive. Kalen glanced at her, the briefest nod signaling understanding. They would face this together, at least for now. The first man tried the door, forcing it with brute strength, and Clara's shotgun barked, the sound cracking across the morning air. A flinch, a stumble, and the first attacker fell, his companions pausing at the sudden violence. Snow drifted past the window, powdering the scene outside as if trying to obscure the moment. But there was no hiding the truth. They were intruders. And the homestead was not theirs. Kalen moved swiftly, silent as the wind, intercepting the second man before he could reach the door. His strength and skill were immediate, precise, and terrifying. Clara felt a rush of awe and fear, realizing the depth of his capability, the lethal force restrained only by necessity. In that instant, she knew the truth of their connection was more than proximity or shared solitude, it was survival, trust, and unspoken alliance. Hours passed in a tense ballet of movement, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The ranchers circled, shouted, tried to find an opening, but Clara and Kalen held the cabin, each instinctively covering the other, each silently communicating with glances, gestures, breaths. The bond between them deepened in the crucible of danger, fragile yet unbreakable. Forged in fire and fear. By midday, the attackers had retreated, grumbling and defeated, leaving the prairie quiet once more. Clara lowered her rifle, hands shaking, body trembling, and Kalen studied the tracks left behind, calculating the likelihood of return. She realized the truth that had been forming since the night he first arrived. This man, this warrior from another world, was no longer a stranger. He was her protector, her ally, her unexpected anchor in the storm of her life. Outside, the snow glistened cold and clean, the prairie silent but holding the memory of violence and survival. Inside, Clara and Kalen shared a quiet moment, the fire crackling, the world pressing against them yet unable to reach the fragile bubble they had carved for themselves. Danger had knocked at their doorstep, tested their resolve, and retreated. But both knew it would return, and that the bonds forged in battle would be needed again. The prairie had delivered its message in blood. Snow and wind. Survival required more than courage, it required trust, partnership, and the willingness to face the impossible together. And Clara, for the first time since Eli's death, felt the stirrings of hope, tinged with fear and longing. For a future she could not yet imagine, the prairie seemed quieter after the morning's chaos. But Clara knew the world outside would never truly be still. She moved through Homestead with a new awareness, her senses sharpened by the knowledge that danger could return at any moment. Kalen was there, silent but present, his dark eyes constantly scanning, calculating, observing. His presence was both a comfort and a complication, a reminder that survival often required more than just courage. It required adaptability, trust, and an understanding that two worlds could intersect in ways neither had imagined. Kalen had been observing her work for days, noting her routines, learning her rhythms. He approached each task with a quiet curiosity, offering guidance without overt interference, suggesting ways to conserve energy, manage the cattle, and recognize the subtle signs of intruders. Clara had grown skilled in prairie life, but under his tutelage, she discovered details she had overlooked, nuances in the land, the wind, and the movement of animals that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. She watched him carefully, noticing the grace in his movements, the efficiency in his hands, the way he seemed attuned to the smallest sounds and shifts in the environment. Kalen's world was one shaped by survival, by a deep connection to the land and the people who depended on it. Clara realized she had lived in her own version of survival, one limited by isolation, grief, and fear, and that by combining their knowledge, they were creating something stronger, more resilient. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the fence near the northern pasture, a sudden movement caught Clara's eye. A coyote slinking along the tree line, hungry and silent, reminded her of how precarious life could be. Kalen's hand was on hers before she could react, steadying, guiding, teaching her the best angle to strike with the rifle. The moment was brief, instinctive, but it revealed the delicate balance between them, a mix of guidance, trust, and unspoken connection that had grown since the first night. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the air filled with the scent of burning wood and the subtle warmth of shared space. Clara found herself asking questions about Kalen's world, his tribe, the people he had lost, and he answered with honesty and patience, sometimes leaving gaps where memory was too painful. She shared her own story, her grief for Eli, her determination to keep the homestead alive. Each revelation drew them closer, two lives intertwining in the quiet intimacy of understanding and mutual respect. Yet despite the growing connection, the differences between them were stark. Language was only one barrier. Customs, beliefs, and the unspoken codes of their separate worlds created tension and hesitation. Clara sometimes felt the weight of judgment, the pressure of society that would never accept this union. Kalen carried the burden of exile, of displacement, of a life uprooted and scattered. And still, they pressed forward, navigating the delicate terrain of shared purpose and forbidden closeness. One evening, as the sky turned the color of embers, Clara noticed Kalen staring toward the horizon, his expression unreadable. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. He glanced at her, eyes dark and intense, and for a moment, the warrior in him and the man she had begun to know seemed to collide. "I am thinking that this land, this place, it could be ours," he said, voice low and deliberate. "If we protect it together." His words carried more than strategy, they carried hope, promise. and the first tentative acknowledgement of possibility beyond mere survival. The prairie, vast and unforgiving, stretched around them, indifferent to human struggles yet shaping them in ways they could not ignore. Clara felt the pulse of the land beneath her feet, a rhythm that resonated with Kalen's presence, binding them through experience, shared hardship, and the recognition that their worlds, though different, were not incompatible. In learning from each other, they were becoming stronger, more capable, and more entwined, their lives a delicate dance between caution and desire, fear and trust. By nightfall, the fire had burned low, and the prairie outside seemed endless and quiet. Inside, Clara and Kalen sat together, their hands brushing occasionally, sharing warmth, exchanging glances that spoke volumes without words. Their worlds had collided irrevocably, and the bond forged in danger, necessity, and understanding was growing into something neither could ignore. Two worlds, separate and distinct, were now intertwined, and the prairie held its breath, waiting to see what this collision of lives would create. The threat returned, sharper and closer than before. Word had spread through the settlements that a young widow clung stubbornly to her land, aided by a stranger, a man of Apache descent. The wealthy rancher, Silas Granger, arrived one afternoon on horseback, his polished boots glinting in the sun, his hat tilted just enough to cast a shadow over calculating eyes. His smile was practiced, his demeanor calm. But Clara recognized the danger in it, the kind of danger that moved through law and intimidation. Not guns alone. You should consider selling, Silas said smoothly, dismounting with ease. This land is valuable, worth more than any widow could manage alone. I could protect it for you, even for your sake. His gaze flicked toward Kalen, though he did not speak his suspicion aloud. Clara's pulse quickened. She did not trust him, never had, and she did not intend to surrender what she and Eli had built. I am not selling, Clara said firmly, standing tall despite the cold knot of fear in her stomach. This land is mine. Her voice carried authority, honed over months of survival, and though it trembled slightly, it was unwavering. Silas's smile faltered, just enough to reveal the edge beneath his civility, the menace in his politeness. Silas's next words were measured, deliberate, meant to intimidate. You may not have the choice if you continue to resist. There are men willing to enforce an arrangement. Mrs. Holt, one way or another, this land could be mine. He spoke slowly, each word calculated to pierce her resolve, and Clara felt the weight of his threat settle in her chest. Kalen stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Clara and Silas. His presence was imposing. Silent, but every muscle was tense, prepared for violence if necessary. Clara felt a surge of gratitude and fear, knowing that his loyalty was absolute but also aware that any confrontation could be deadly. The rancher, though confident, seemed to sense the silent warning in Kalen's posture. For a brief moment, the tension between them was almost palpable. A tight wire stretched across the space, ready to snap. You cannot threaten her, Kalen said quietly, his voice steady but low, carrying the weight of authority and warning. His words were not loud, but they cut through the morning air with the force of someone used to being obeyed. Silas studied him, the subtle interplay of cultures and strength apparent in the unspoken challenge. He did not strike immediately, recognizing the risk, but his next words were deliberate, filled with menace and promise. This is not over, he said, backing away, mounting his horse, and leaving with a slow, deliberate glare that promised retaliation. Clara's hands trembled after he left. The storm of intimidation had passed, but its residue lingered, pressing against her chest and mind. Kalen moved closer, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. They will try again, he said. And we must be ready, not just to protect your land, but to protect you. His eyes held hers, dark and unyielding, and Clara felt the fragile thrill of trust, and the unspoken bond between them deepened. Evening fell over the prairie, turning the snow and land into pale shadows. Clara worked to secure her fences, gather supplies, and plan for what was coming. Every decision was now measured, every move calculated, guided by necessity and survival. Kaylin remained at her side, silent and alert, teaching her new ways to track, detect threats, and anticipate danger. Their relationship had grown beyond mere survival. It was now a partnership forged in the crucible of shared adversity. By nightfall, Clara and Kaylin stood near the fire, surveying the land around them. The prairie stretched in silent expanse, indifferent to human struggles, yet holding within it the echoes of conflict and resistance. They knew the ranchers would return, and perhaps more men with Silas's wealth in reach would come to test their resolve. Yet in that moment, standing side by side, they also knew that they were stronger together than apart. That two worlds, once divided by fear and prejudice, were now united in trust, survival, and a fragile but undeniable loyalty. The ranchers' ultimatum had come and gone, but the real battle was only beginning. Clara's heart thrummed with fear, determination, and something else, something unspoken but undeniable. One thing was certain: she and Kaylin would face whatever came next together, and the prairie would bear witness to their fight. The prairie at night was silent, but the stillness carried a weight heavier than the wind. Clara and Kaylin moved through the cabin quietly, their routine no longer just survival but a shared rhythm, a dance neither fully acknowledged aloud yet deeply felt. Every glance lingered a heartbeat too long. Every brush of hands against one another sparked a tension neither wanted to name, and the cold outside only magnified the warmth growing between them. After the threat of Silas Granger, the tension of the day pressed against them like the snow outside the cabin walls. Clara found herself walking closer to Kaylin without conscious intent, drawn by something she had tried to ignore since the first night he arrived, an attraction that carried both danger and promise. She caught herself in the lamplight, realizing how often she studied him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the curve of his jaw, the intensity in his dark eyes, the quiet strength in his hands. He was different from anyone she had ever known, and every difference only deepened the pull between them. Kaylin sensed it too. He moved beside her with measured caution, aware of the fragile boundary neither of them wanted to cross too quickly. Yet every small touch, the brief meeting of hands while passing a bucket, the careful adjustment of a blanket over her shoulders, the shared glance in the flickering lamplight stirred something raw and uncontainable in both of them. He had known grief, loss, and exile, but Clara's presence sparked something new, something he had not dared to name: hope, desire, and the possibility of connection that transcended the rules of the world outside. Night deepened, and the prairie was cloaked in frost and shadow. Clara carried a tray of tea to the fire and offered it to Kaylin. Their hands brushed, fingers grazing, and for a brief moment, the world shrank until it was only the two of them, the warm fire between them and the fragile, potent tension that had been building for days. Neither spoke, yet the unspoken words filled the cabin. Trust, attraction, longing, and the silent acknowledgement that what they shared was forbidden, precarious, and impossible to ignore. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "Do you ever think about your people?" she asked softly, settling onto a blanket near the fire. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from the vulnerability of admitting curiosity and concern. Kaylin's eyes softened, dark and reflective. "Every day," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of memories too painful to speak aloud. "They are the reason I survive, the reason I endure." Clara nodded, sensing the truth in his words, feeling the depth of his connection to a world she could barely comprehend. They leaned closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of shared solitude and understanding. The heat of the fire and the cold of the prairie outside contrasted sharply, emphasizing the intensity of their closeness. Their shoulders brushed, and Clara felt a thrill of warmth and fear, the delicate tension of something dangerous yet irresistible. Kaylin's hand moved tentatively to hers, resting gently, almost reverently. And she did not pull away. In the shadows, their bond strengthened. A fragile intimacy that existed between words, gestures, and shared glances. Every moment together built layers of trust and desire, a slow burn that neither could deny. Clara realized she was drawn not just to the man before her, but to the strength, resilience, and honor he embodied, to the way he had stepped into her life when she had believed herself alone. Kaylin understood the unspoken as well, feeling a stir in his heart for a woman who had survived grief, hardship, and isolation with grace and courage. The night pressed on, and the prairie held its breath. Outside, snow drifted silently, covering tracks and erasing evidence of the day's struggles. Inside, Clara and Kaylin shared quiet moments that were their own, moments that carried the weight of two worlds colliding and hearts awakening. Love, tentative and shadowed by circumstance, had begun to bloom, fragile yet undeniable. Neither could say where it would lead, but both understood that once the pull between them had begun, it could not be ignored. By the time the fire burned low, the night had etched itself into memory. In silence, in the glow of lamplight and fire, two hearts from different worlds had found each other in the shadows, a connection that would endure beyond fear, prejudice, and danger. The prairie waited outside, patient and indifferent, while inside, love took its first cautious, impossible steps. The dawn was bloodless and quiet, the prairie cloaked in frost and stillness, but the calm was deceptive. Clara and Kaylin had sensed it, an unease that gnawed at the edges of the day, the kind of tension that preceded violence. The ranchers had returned, more numerous than before, their horses stamping and hooves kicking up snow and dirt. Silas Granger led them, his polished boots scuffing the frozen earth, his face a mask of arrogance and determination. He had underestimated them once, but he would not make the same mistake again. Clara's hands tightened around the rifle. Every breath drew the cold into her lungs, sharpening her senses, making each sound and movement louder and more deliberate. Kaylin moved beside her, silent and precise, a shadow of strength and calculated power. They had prepared for this moment, reinforcing fences, creating barricades, and readying every strategy the prairie had taught them. Yet even with preparation, the looming battle carried the unpredictable chaos of fear, desperation, and human cruelty. The first rider charged, shouting a warning, testing defenses, and Kaylin intercepted him with swift precision, disarming and disabling before the man could reach the homestead. Clara fired her rifle once, then twice, the echoes ringing across the prairie like a warning to the rest. Snow swirled around them, masking movements and muffling sounds, and the ranchers struggled against the unfamiliar terrain, unaware that every inch of the land was now known to those defending it. Hours passed in a blur of strategy, movement, and violence. Clara and Kaylin moved in tandem, instinctively covering each other, communicating through gestures, glances, and brief commands. Their bond, forged in trust and tempered by weeks of shared danger, allowed them to anticipate each other's movements with uncanny precision. Every attack was met with calculated defense, every attempt to breach their walls countered with strength and skill honed by necessity. Clara found herself surprised by her own capability. Fear had sharpened her senses, grief had hardened her resolve, and love, new, tentative, and fierce, had fueled her courage. She was no longer merely defending land. She was defending a life she had begun to cherish, a bond she could not allow to be broken. Kaylin noticed her growth, his eyes dark with admiration and pride. yet clouded with worry for the stakes they faced. As the sun climbed, casting harsh shadows across the snow, the tide of battle shifted. The ranchers, confident and unrelenting, pressed harder, seeking to overwhelm with sheer numbers. But then, as if drawn by instinct and loyalty, Kalen's surviving kin arrived on horseback, warriors who had tracked him for days, drawn by knowledge of his peril. Their arrival was sudden, overwhelming, and decisive. With their aid, the tide turned against Silas and his men, the prairie echoing with the sounds of struggle, shouts, and retreat. By afternoon, the ranchers had fled, beaten but alive, leaving the homestead and prairie silent once more. Clara lowered her rifle, chest heaving, body trembling, and Kalen's hand found hers, grounding her, steadying her. The battle was over, but its lessons lingered. Danger could strike at any moment, but courage, preparation, and unity could withstand even the harshest storm. In the quiet aftermath, they surveyed the homestead, the snow stained with tracks, disturbed earth, and signs of struggle. Yet it was theirs. Clara realized with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that they had protected not just land, but life, dignity, and the fragile promise of their shared future. Kalen's presence beside her was a constant reassurance, a silent vow that they would face whatever came next together. That night, the fire burned high, and the cabin smelled of wood smoke and victory. The prairie stretched in endless silence beyond the walls, indifferent yet respectful, bearing witness to the endurance of two lives intertwined by danger, love, and survival. Clara leaned against Kalen, feeling the warmth and strength of his body, the steady pulse of his heart against her own. The battle had been won, but the journey, the story of their hearts, their worlds, and the future they would carve together, was only beginning. The prairie was quiet in a way that felt sacred after the storm of the past days. Snow drifted lazily across the open land, covering the traces of conflict and leaving only the promise of a fresh beginning. Clara stood at the edge of her homestead, the wind tugging gently at her skirts, and felt the pulse of the land beneath her feet, steady, enduring, unyielding. She breathed in the cold air, crisp and clean, tasting freedom in every inhale. Kalen stood beside her, silent, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with that same careful awareness that had kept him alive for so long. Yet there was something different now, something softer, tempered by relief and the quiet thrill of survival, something unspoken that hovered between them. The prairie had tested them, the world had conspired against them. Yet here they stood, together, unbroken, the bond between them forged not just in love, but in shared struggle and trust. Do you ever wonder what comes next? Clara asked, her voice carrying lightly in the morning stillness. She did not need to ask who would remain by her side. She already knew. Kalen's gaze met hers, unwavering, and he smiled faintly, a shadow of the warmth he had hidden for so long. I have only known the present, he said, voice low but certain, but with you, perhaps we can shape the future. The words hung between them like a promise. Clara felt a surge of hope, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with the man standing beside her. The future had always seemed uncertain, a path clouded by grief, prejudice, and the unforgiving prairie. But now it felt wide, open, and inviting. A place where two lives from different worlds could intersect without fear. They began to walk together across the snow-covered fields, Kalen's hand brushing against hers. Tentative at first, then deliberately entwined. Each step was a rhythm of connection, of mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement that they were choosing this life together, despite the worlds that sought to keep them apart. The wind carried with it the scent of pine and earth, the echoes of the battles fought, the voices of the prairie whispering in approval, as if the land itself recognized their claim not just to the homestead, but to each other. In the distance, the sun broke over the horizon, casting long golden rays across the snow. The prairie blazed with light, warm and inviting, as if celebrating the union of two hearts that had fought, endured, and survived. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sheer magnitude of relief and possibility. She had faced fear, loss, and loneliness, yet now, with Kaylin by her side, she felt the extraordinary power of resilience, trust, and love. Kaylin's voice cut softly through the quiet. "We are not bound by where we came from. We are bound by what we choose to build together." Clara nodded, understanding the depth of his words, the freedom they represented. They were not prisoners of circumstance, nor captives of expectation. They could shape a life together that respected their past while embracing a future no one had dared to imagine. They returned to the cabin as the morning grew warmer, hands still clasped, hearts beating in unison. The homestead was secure, the land intact, and the prairie stretched endlessly beyond, holding secrets, challenges, and beauty in equal measure. Inside, the fire had been rekindled, crackling and warm, a mirror of the life they would now cultivate together. That night, as the stars shimmered over the quiet prairie, Clara and Kaylin sat side by side, the silence comfortable, the connection undeniable. The world outside could no longer touch them. Their love, their courage, and their bond had created a life that transcended fear, prejudice, and boundaries. One night had changed everything, but every day after that would continue to define them. A testament to survival, passion, and the power of two hearts daring to defy the world together. The prairie waited in quiet reverence, endless and eternal. And Clara knew in her heart that she had found not only a partner but a home, not in land or blood alone, but in the love and life she would share with Kaylin for all the days to come.